Hello, good to see you again, to talk again to my followers, my watchers, my readers. So today we are in our third episode in the 4-episode series that I have about the US-Israel relations. And this is an episode that will lead us to the current situation with particular emphasis on the situation under President Donald Trump. But I just want to remind us that I said last time that this episode would be more about delving deeply or more deeply into the forces, particularly in the US, which shaped these special relations that we have described already in our two episodes, in the first 2 episodes, what I call the interesting relationships at the beginning and then the special relationships. So when we talk about the relationship with the US, we have to say that in the 1950s, after the recognition of Israel by Harry Truman, the establishment of the diplomatic relations, basically the 1950s were dominated by the Republican Party under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And one has to say that at that time, the Eisenhower administration could not really be considered to be too pro-Israel or even pro-Israel. In some ways it was, in many other ways it wasn't. John Foster Dulles, the architect of American foreign policy at that time, was definitely not a friend of Israel. And when the US looked at the situation in the Middle East and looked at it from the perspective of the Cold War, the idea that really dominated American foreign policy in the 1950s was much more like an alliance with pro-West Arab countries. What they tried to establish, the Baghdad alliance, which failed, but they tried to do it. And then came the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, following the pressure on Israel to withdraw from Sinai in the Sinai War, which was basically, again, anti-communist, but was not based on any alliance between the US and Israel. So one has to say that even though the Israelis already in 1958 were very helpful to the West by allowing British airplanes to fly to Jordan over Israeli territory in order to help what seemed at that time to be a danger to the existence of the regime of the Hashemite King Hussein in Jordan. That was the result of what happened in the Middle East after the Syrian-Egyptian alliance unity, and what seemed to be the Soviet penetration to the very core of the Middle East through the leadership and charisma of Nasser, this anti-Western, anti-American, of course, anti-Israel Arab leader. But in the US itself, already in the 1950s, we see the creation of a coalition that would be very helpful to better relations between the US and Israel, that was composed of various elements. And of course, in the first place, it was the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community already in 1948-49, during the War of Independence, and even before the beginning of it, showed a great deal of support to Israel. There were many American volunteers who came to fight on behalf of Israel, including pilots that were the beginning of the Israeli Air Force, the great Israeli Air Force, one should say. There was this famous Colonel Mickey Marcus, that was recruited by the Zionists in the US and by Israel to become a commander in the Israeli army, and then it was his tragic death by mistake in an accident that happened. He became the hero of a later movie called Cast a Giant Shadow. The star of this movie was Kirk Douglas himself, a great supporter of Israel, just died a few years ago when he was over 100 years old. But we saw that the main components of this coalition, alongside the American Jewish community, in the 1950s, they established the famous organization known as AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, were basically elements that were connected more with the Democratic Party rather than with the Republican Party. Give you an example, which is not always known. The American labor movement, the AFL-CIO, under the great leadership of George Meany, was tremendously supportive of Israel. Meany said, by the way, that the AFL-CIO are the greatest supporters of Israel in the world, no less than that. So, of course, he was a supporter of the Democratic Party, but also in the minority communities in the US, there was more support to Israel at that time. And if we go from the 50s to the 60s and even a bit later on, we see at least two very significant key figures that were really fighting, struggling for human rights, civil rights in the US and equality, were very pro-Israel. One of them was Martin Luther King, no other, who said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, was so supportive of Israel. Of course, he got a lot of support from the Jewish community. We remember the Rabbi Eshel marching alongside him and other prominent Jewish leaders. Take even Cesar Chavez, the great Mexican-American leader of the migrant farm workers, who was also very pro-Zionist. He was attacked for this by leftists who couldn't agree with the fact that he was pro-Israel. Take even in the field of culture, I mean the cultural world, a guy like Harry Belafonte, the famous singer and activist that was so pro-Israel, singing Hava Nagila and Ine Ma Tovu Manaim and so on, Sammy Davis Jr. and others, you know. So you could see the beginning of the creation of this pro-Israel coalition that would become more significant in the 1970s, when you started to see a change also in the Republican Party. And part of this change had to do with the move among evangelical Christians towards the adoption of their doctrines that would lead them to become very pro-Israel. Take, for example, famous leader Billy Graham, who visited Israel in 1960. By the way, later on, when we heard the recordings of President Richard Nixon during the Watergate crisis, we heard some unpleasant comment made by Billy Graham about Jews to the ears of the president at that time, which I'll come back a little bit later on to the Evangelicals, which, yes, of course, it was not good, you know, but in the overall context of creation of a pro-Israel coalition, people like Billy Graham at that time and other people later on played a very significant role. So we see a change also in the Republican Party, and this change became very, very important, very, very significant, you know, particularly in the 1980s during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who was instinctively pro-Israel, not from an evangelical Christian perspective, but from the perspective of here it is. It's a world conflict between the good guys, the bad guys. Israelis are on the side of the good guys. They are our friends. They are against the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is against them. So the Republican Party was changing in all kinds of respects, and Ronald Reagan symbolized it. By the way, less so his successor, Bush the father, as opposed to Bush the son later on. So we see a situation whereby, as of the 1970s, in Congress, for example, the support to Israel is becoming the element, the feature of what would be the main pillar, perhaps, of the pro-Israel sentiment in the US and the basis for the special relationship, the bipartisan support. Bipartisanship was very significant. And it had to remain like that. We shall see what happens as we get closer to our situation. Part of it we'll say today, part of it we'll leave to the last episode. But the fact of the matter is that even when you could see the shaping up of this coalition composed of people in both parties in Congress in great support of Israel, you also add at the same time the elements that in recent years would become much more influential than what they used to be at that time. Not so much in the Jewish community. The anti-Zionist elements within the Jewish community that were mainly focused around the reform movement in the old days, later on what was called the American Council for Judaism and other such organizations. In the 1950s, 60s, particularly after the 6 Days War, and of course during the campaign conducted by so many important American Jewish organizations, basically the American Jewish community in support of Soviet Jewry and the campaign to let our people go from the Soviet Union. So the Jewish community in the 1960s, 70s really moving very strongly towards the side of support to Israel, not necessarily organizations like the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress or even the ADL would say we are Zionist organizations, but they definitely were very, very pro-Israel. So their way of showing pro-Israel was by support every legislation that would be pro-Israel in Congress, the support for financial and military aid to Israel, and all kinds of other aspects of the relationship. But you could see elements that were already at that time starting to create this nucleus or the roots of what would be anti-Israelism later on. Isolationists in the Republican Party, fiscal conservatives of one kind or another, nativist politicians. Much later on, more recently, you could hear people like Ron Paul, for example, or even before him, Pat Buchanan, as examples of the fact that even in the Republican Party, as it was moving more and more towards more pro-Israel approach, you still add these elements of strong isolationism and even, I would say, nativist politics that were anti-Israel. You could also see changes starting to develop within the Democratic Party by the rise of left wing in the party that would include, as of the 1970s, 80s, and afterwards, elements that otherwise were previously very pro-Israel. One example of it is what happened to the people around Martin Luther King Jr. He was pro-Zionist, he was pro-Jewish, he was pro-Israel, and some of the closest people to him later on would develop either overt anti-Israel positions, and even on occasions anti-Semitism, such as the famous or infamous ugly comments by Jesse Jackson about the Amy Town, New York, and even people like John Lewis, the late John Lewis, that changed their tune about Israel, and the same would happen also among other minority communities or in the Hispanic community and so on and so forth. So you could see that while in Congress there still was very strong support to Israel based on bipartisanship, you could also see and hear and view the forces that would be against it, that on occasion seemed to be very marginal, but because of changes in American society later on would become much stronger. From the Israeli perspective, it was obvious that Israel needs to maintain bipartisan support. It was obvious. That was a main pillar of the approach. And that was the strength of it, the bipartisan support. And it had to be kept. There were occasions in which the late Menachem Begin, for example, strongly reprimanded the junior Democratic senator visiting Israel by the name of Joseph Biden Jr. He also reprimanded the Republican Charles Percy. And after, during the Reagan administration, there were some incidents, diplomatic problems between the two countries. Menachem Begin knew how to criticize strongly, let alone maybe even attack, policies of the Reagan administration. So it was clear that while the Israelis were trying to maintain their policy of bipartisanship in terms of American support to Israel, when Israeli leaders needed to criticize Democrats and Republicans, they would have done it, but always within the context of maintaining the basic framework of bipartisan support to Israel. And that's something that we have to bear in mind. When you look at this support to Israel, and you look at Republican senators, for example, from places without any Jews, Wyoming, Montana, very few Jews, and saying whatever they say about supporting Israel, it puts in perspective all these, comments, one should say attacks, I would say anti-Semitically motivated attacks on AIPAC, bribing all those politicians. I myself heard on occasions politicians from both parties, by the way, saying, they say that I'm in the pocket of the Jews in my state, I was looking for Jews in my state, I hardly found any, So obviously, there was always this sense that the support to Israel was not without its critics and attacks on it. AIPAC became, of course, the symbol of this support to Israel, and was therefore the target of a lot of criticism that was motivated, of course, by not just, but also by anti-Semitic motives, like the Jews maintain only one loyalty. First loyalty is to Israel, the firsters, those who support Israel, as opposed to supporting the US. Now, let's face it, the alliance with the US was based on two key pillars. One of them was the sense of common values, common political heritage. Israel is being the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is like us, is like the US. It's a democracy. It's a liberal democracy. We have problems with this or that Israeli policy, but altogether it is a country that we can associate with. It is on the right side of history. Then the other side of it was, of course, the strategic, political, military, common interest between the two countries that were not without their problems on occasions, particularly when there were Likud governments that tended to be more toward the right wing, but not only. After all, it was a Likud government that made the peace with Egypt when the president was Jimmy Carter. And other Likud governments did accept American requests / pressures on other occasions. For example, during the first Gulf War, when the prime minister at that time, Yitzhak Shamir, a very hawkish Israeli prime minister, agreed with President George H.W. Bush that even if there would be Iraqi missiles fired on Israel, and Israel knew there would be, if it wasn't having chemical warheads, there won't be an Israeli response, so as not to turn this war into an Arab-Israeli war, something that Saddam Hussein wanted. That was a big service from Israel to the US. Not every country would like to see 42 Scud missiles falling on its centers of population and not reacting because they succumb to the interest of a bigger ally, in that case the US. And one has to say it. And by the way, Shamir at that time, and I can tell you I know it, trust me, I know it, was under heavy pressure from his defense minister, the late Moshe Arens, the great late Moshe Arens, who said Israel has to react. We cannot lose our power of deterrence. And Shamir said no. The overall interest of maintaining the alliance with the US was more important. Yes, Israel had 12 requests from the US at that time. 11 of them were fulfilled. One was not. Well, let's move on beyond that. So the point really is that the coalition that existed in the US that was supportive of Israel, that was enhanced and strengthened by the ongoing, gradual but consistent mobilization of the Christian evangelical community in support of Israel alongside the other traditional forces of support, really laid the groundwork for what was really considered to be almost like an automatic alliance. You knew that the US would veto any anti-Israeli resolution in the UN, in the Security Council. You knew that Israel would always vote with the UN when it came to important situations for the US. You knew that Israel would always consult, or at least try to consult, with America about particular big national security decisions. What happened, and we see it already in the late 1980s, 1990s and onwards, that there are starting to be changes. By the way, in the Jewish community, one has to say it. Yes, even today, the reform movement is members of the World Zionist organizations, and they are Zionists in their way. But when you look at the reform movement of the 70s, 60s, 70s, how it moved from its traditional kind of problematic notions about Zionism, about Jewish statehood, Jewish nationalism, to the new crop of rabbis that would become more significant in the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century onwards, you see a difference. You see a difference even in the conservative movement. It always was the mainstream of support to Israel. You could see differences that would affect the academic community in the Jewish community, the academics in the Jewish community. You could see it in universities. I saw it personally. I experienced it in my own situation when I came to talk in universities and in spending sabbaticals. What happened was a combination of various factors. I will just mention two, not necessarily the most important ones. There are many others, but that's a topic that has to be discussed in a separate way. It's such a big topic, the American Jewish community in Israel. One of them is the growing strength of a new ideology that was propagated by many in the reform movement, and less so, but also in the conservative movement, the Tikkun Olam ideology. It is the repairing of the world is the number one Jewish mitzvah, a Jewish challenge, something that I personally, of course, very much opposed to. I consider it to be an attempt to justify, without saying it, a kind of running away, perhaps even stampede on the part of others from the sense of we are Jews, therefore we support Israel because this is the state of the Jewish people and we feel part of the Jewish people. The element of Tikkun Olam has become very significant. And taking one element in Judaism, making it so significant, it's a very significant development in the Jewish community. One has to accept it. Now, the other element is the decreasing support among certain age groups, particularly youngsters. Now, here I should say, look, first of all, it's true. One can see it, particularly if you are in the academic world and you come across students. But the explanation to that, is not different than what other ethnic groups in America feel about the home country, the mother country, so to speak, when you talk about the third or fourth generation in these communities. And the Jews are not, in a way, much different than others. As you get more and more away from the memories and legacies of the home country, of the mother country, you develop different attitudes towards it, and I noticed that among people in my classes as a professor, or Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Lebanese Americans, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that you could see the beginning of erosion in Jewish support to Israel. Again, minority among the Jews, but one that has become more vocal. At the same time, the evangelical movement became very significant in the Republican Party. People like Jerry Falwell in the moral majority, Pat Robertson, and all the many others. Of course, John Hagee, the Pentecostal great supporter of Israel in Texas, San Antonio, and others. And what happened was that when these elements in the Republican Party became more and more important and significant in affecting Republican approaches and policies, that's something that we have to say. Take states in the South, where, for example, in South Carolina, in every primary that you have, so people define themselves as Republicans or Democrats, Evangelicals, and so on. It's a Republican state, and 75-80% of Republicans in South Carolina say that they are Evangelicals. So you can imagine the level of support to Israel in a state like that. But the growing support of these Evangelicals encouraged something that would lead to what I would consider to be a great, if not even huge, problem for Israel. The fact that these trends in the American Jewish community were coinciding with what seemed to be the growing dominance of right-wing parties in Israeli politics, the Likud party in particular. Something that affected also the operation of AIPAC, which became more and more associated with pro-republicanism, in a way. More and more Israeli governments led by right-wing, particularly under Netanyahu as of 1996 to 1999, but much more so after 2009, became more and more associated with an AIPAC that seemed to be more Republican. And of course, it could be justified the fact because the Republican Party became more pro-Israel. So those who are pro-Israel are becoming, in a way, more pro-Republican. But the majority of the Jewish community in America did not go along with it. And the problem there was, and one has to say it, there are many problems behind it, but one that I would like to mention now and to emphasize is, many American Jews, despite the claim for supporting liberal democracy and all that comes with it, found it difficult, if not impossible, to support wholeheartedly, strongly, a state like Israel that is dominated by right-wing and religious parties, and government that supported by parties like this that are in Israel itself are mostly supported by the Mizrahi community, the Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. And that has become a cultural problem that would lead to political consequences. The idea that Israel, as it is developing, 1970s, but much more so 1980s, even much more so again 1990s and onwards, is not the Israel that we would like it to be. And that, of course, opens the Pandora box of all this situation of the relationship between Israel as the center of the Jewish world and Jewish communities abroad. What are the limits of the ability and the willingness of Jews outside of Israel to support Israel when they don't like what's happening in Israel? Well, that's a big question. I have to mention it. It's not something that could be kind of brushed under the carpet, because it is an unpleasant topic to discuss. And the fact that things like this happen, as I described, created a growing crisis between Israel and the Democratic Party, in particular, and the constituent groups of the Democratic Party that traditionally used to be so pro-Israel, among minority communities, among the labor movement, for example. It's nothing like it used to be. Things changed. I will end up now by saying it is very easy to pinpoint blame on particular politician. In that case, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel for 16 years after 2009, and before, and 3 years, 1996 to 1999. The problem is that when situations are developing the way I described them, the responsibility of the Israeli leadership at the time should have been to minimize the problems, to try to balance them off, rather than exacerbate them by going with the stream and adopting what seemed to be a very pro-Republican approach, and something, therefore, that would deepen and extend and widen the gaps between Israel and Jews abroad. But as I said, movements within American Jewry were not disconnected to the overall changes in American society, demographic and others. But I will just end up with a teaser to the last episode. And I can say that the last 15 or 20 years, or maybe less, but two mass popular movements emerged in the American political scene. MAGA on the one end, and the woke movement on the other end. The two of them, for different reasons, are not conducive to the alliance between the US and Israel. And we are going to see in the last episode, as I will describe it, how their impact and influence deepened, very much so, the trends that I started to relate to, or that I related to toward the end of this episode. So I leave you with that, and we shall meet again for the final and last episode. How it is under Donald Trump, and of course with the background of the Biden administration and so on and so forth, within the context of the current wars in the Middle East involving Israel. And I say wars because it's not just the war in Gaza. Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.